Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this lovely September afternoon. Today's presentation is on carbon offsetting for commercial properties in New York City. And we are Associated Renewable. We're a leading energy consulting and carbon management company here in New York City. I'm joined today by Jonathan Barker, our account manager.
Good afternoon.
Joe Kosha, another account manager.
Good afternoon.
And I'm William Jaffrey, an energy engineer here at Associated Renewable. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please try to put your speakers on mute. If you're lucky enough to be joining us in person today, have your cell phone on silent. Feel free to ask a question at any time using that little raise hand feature on GoToMeeting, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you have. If there's anything that you'd like to address offline also, feel free to drop us an email at info@associatedrenewable.com. So now to get going, what is a carbon offset? A carbon offset is a unit of carbon dioxide equivalent that is reduced, avoided, or sequestered to compensate for emissions occurring elsewhere. So if you're a business or organization, a building, even an individual, and you know you're responsible for a certain amount of carbon emissions, you can purchase negative carbon emissions essentially and offset the emissions that you're producing. And this doesn't affect just carbon dioxide, it affects all greenhouse gases. But the effect of those greenhouse gases are compared to CO2, and carbon offsets are sold as metric tons of CO2. One carbon offset is 1 metric ton of CO2. There's certain projects that generate carbon offsets. So a renewable energy project will have associated carbon offsets that can also be sold. Also methane collection and combustion. This is common in landfills. Certain energy efficiency projects, reducing the carbon footprint of a certain building or industry, can generate a carbon offset. Also destruction of industrial pollutants. If you know a certain pollutant when it's in the atmosphere has a certain effect, if you can get rid of that's effectively a carbon offset. Also avoided deforestation or reforestation will also generate a carbon offset. So here's an example of how a carbon offset might work for a building. Let's say you have a 100,000 square foot building and you know your yearly emissions are 936 tons of CO2 per year. The first thing obviously to do would be to implement energy efficiency and conservation measures. So in this example, let's say that brings the emissions down to 700 tons of CO2 per year. That divides down to 58 tons of CO2 every month. So if you wanted your facility to be totally carbon neutral and not responsible for any carbon in the atmosphere, you could offset those 58 tons of carbon. And based on the carbon markets right now, the gold standard price of carbon is about $18 a ton. So your offset cost would be $1,044 every month. And then again, you'd have a completely carbon neutral facility. This all kind of came about through the Kyoto Protocol, which is a 1997 UN agreement that mandated reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. All the major nations came together and agreed on this protocol, and then the ratification process began, and this protocol actually came into force in 2005. And what it did is it set specific emissions reductions for each country. It looked at what each country was doing and what a reasonable reduction would be for that country. The US, under the Kyoto Protocol, would have to reduce emissions 7% below what they were in 1999. However, the US is one of the only major nations that has not ratified the agreement. We have not submitted to these emissions reductions, and that is a lot of the reason why we don't have a carbon cap and trade in place at the moment. However, over 500 US cities, including New York City, have pledged to abide by this protocol. However, there are no associated penalties. The penalties that the UN established do not affect those cities because the cities obviously are not UN members. But it still is an encouraging sign to see that there is kind of this grassroots movement in the US to abide by the Kyoto Protocol. So why is carbon offsetting relevant now? Why are we even talking about this? This is largely because of the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We have all heard a lot about global climate change in the last couple of years, and we know that it is an important factor. It causes not only environmental damage, but also increasing resource efficiency. So for commercial buildings and businesses in the United States, global climate change can mean uncertainty in your future profits, not just in being good to the environment. Also, green technologies have really been on the rise, and we have the ability now to control our carbon a lot more than we ever could in the past. Different power production techniques and energy efficiency measures that we are now aware of allow us to really make changes in our lifestyle and affect our carbon production. It's also important to note that American energy habits are very different from global energy habits. We here in America have some of the highest energy consumption per capita, and so using some of those green technologies, we can bring our carbon production down quite a bit and help some of these problems. And how this applies to U.S. commercial buildings. This is really a big factor because commercial buildings in the U.S. consume 39% of America's energy and 68% of its electricity, and they emit 38% of the carbon dioxide found in the air. And studies show that lighting, HVAC, and office equipment consume the most energy in a typical commercial building. So if we can make significant changes to the way our commercial buildings operate, we can bring that 38% down, and that will have a significant dent in the U.S. Carbon emissions. Now I'm going to turn things over to Jonathan.
Hi. So the key parties really involved at the moment in the carbon market. You've got the trading companies, as you can see now. So you've got Citibank, Bank of America, Barclays, and JP Morgan. Now Citibank have pledged by the end of 2012 they're going to purchase 1.17 million credits. Obviously, the major points of that being to be seen as more carbon neutral is one factor, and certainly to be involved in the market that has such scope for growth. Bank of America as well invested $20 billion in the last 5 years in green initiatives since 2007. That's even during a recession. So certainly that's a big factor and a huge amount of money, obviously, for the bank to get involved. Now Barclays, what they've done in the last year is actually spun off a carbon management division called Tricorona. So obviously they're doing the same thing. They started a trading factor in carbon management, but this, like I said, spin-offs happen. JP Morgan have done something very similar. They're run by Eco Management, that's their carbon division there. Now, going into the trading aspect, Mercer Savings Bank, now what they've actually done is they're recommending that 40% of any person's portfolio in the investment world should be in green alternative investments. Obviously that leads to diversification. We've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, especially in 2010 and 11, that for any person's portfolio, whether it's stock market, equities, bonds, should be involved in this side, especially as we've seen such a massive amount of growth in the last 10 years, and the forecast for the next 20 or 30 years is massive. So people are certainly getting involved in that through advisory as well. And like I said, it's like it says here, expect climate change to contribute to 10% to portfolio risk in the next 10 years. So obviously you can see that the big banks, the big names are certainly looking at getting involved, have got involved, and this is just the beginning. This is the start to the carbon market. The market structure works in these ways. So the types of credits you can buy, the main ones that are on the market at the moment are the CERs, which is a certified emission reduction, and the VERs, which is voluntary emission reductions. Now the CERs, they're certified, so they actually have to be bought by companies as part of EU regulation, especially. Obviously, Bill was saying about the US. Obviously, there's no penalties involved, but going into the EU at the moment there are. So especially for airlines have been hit hard, so they're certainly having to buy these carbon credits, these certified emission reductions, to be compliant. So there's certainly a lot of regulation in that aspect, especially the manufacturing industry as well, and oil companies certainly with their usage and damage to the environment are buying these credits as an image statement and as probably an investment as well. Now when you move to the voluntary emission reductions, now anyone can purchase them, from a private investor all the way to institutional investors, whether it is an investment or it's to be seen as more ethically aware. An example of this, Chevrolet, they have pledged to buy 8 million credits, so the equivalent of 8 million tonnes of CO2, to reduce their carbon footprint voluntarily. Now obviously they're doing that to show to their clients, to show to customers that they're voluntarily going out their way to purchase these credits. Obviously, the price itself, it just shows that they can stamp mark, almost like the same thing with commercial buildings, to stamp mark their facility being carbon neutral is the same as Chevrolet doing the same as that, to be seen as carbon neutral, a car company obviously as well. Now the exchange is probably one of the big factors of growth for the carbon market. So there is a California Carbon Exchange, the CCEX. Now that's an OTC market, so basically buying and selling over the counter. So in essence, someone could buy a credit at, let's say, €4 and want to sell that and put an offer in at €6 or €7, and obviously because it's over the counter, someone can purchase that. Alternatively, it could just be left there, on the exchange until it's swiped up. But I mean, at the moment, obviously, there's so much growth in that exchange. Now, moving to the intercontinental exchange, that's at a high growth at the moment. So I mean, obviously, the intercontinental exchange is oil, anything from oil, natural gas to commodities. But they're basically putting the carbon and emission futures there. So you can see with the EUA allowance and certainly with the CERs as well, you can see as well as purchase the price of CERs in the future. So for example, they're trading at around €2. I think it's 196 today they're trading out. And that's for December 2012. So I mean, certainly having a market, having the market grow and having an exchange specifically for these credits is another important factor for growth. So whether a company is investing to try and make money or seeing as to be carbon neutral, almost trying to kill two birds with one stone. So being able to invest as well as be seen as carbon neutral is a big thing in this day and age. Especially with the markets the way they are at the moment. So I'll hand you over to Joe.
Well, basically, I mean, what we can do right now in the US, it's voluntary basically. There's nothing mandatory. All of that's really in Europe. But it's going to come to us. It might be a few years, 5 years, whatever it is. So a couple of things that you could do that are very easy. Paying for the amount of carbon you emit when you go to the airport and purchasing a ticket. Each of us can do that. All the airlines have that in place. Also, awareness of your carbon footprint. They have these online calculators, carbonfund.org, which allows you to enter the information and basically purchase offsets. So it's, each one of us can be aware. And this is something that's good for us leading up to when we are regulated, so you do know where you stand. But I guess in summary, as we were talking about it, everything is moving in the direction of this happening in the U.S. I mean, it's not a question of when it's going to be. It's going to happen. And just to explain, the carbon offsetting is the process of purchasing a carbon credit for every ton of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere. Regulations exist in Europe, and we feel, they're going to be created in the U.S. in the near future. So that's something that's down the road. And I guess basically we should all be aware of our carbon footprint, and I think that's happening now. That's the trend. If you want a copy of this presentation or any specific questions, you can contact us at info@associatedrenewable.com.
I think with that, we'll turn it over to questions. Let me pull up our browser over here, see if anybody online has questions, or if anybody in the room has questions. We'd be happy to address those at this time. No? Okay, well, thank you for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you again next week for next week's webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.